Welcome to all you storm watchers, storm chasers, and Leanierologists to another edition of Tempest Talks. Last month, we talked about handling the storm from the perspective of a leader and a leader in a large organization. This month, we're speaking with my good friend, Martin Lodge, on facilitating the storm. So that pesky little point of actually leading this to fruition. So Martin spent the first 10 years of his employment as an industrial and manufacturing engineer at several companies. The following 30 years of his career were spent in aerospace at Goodrich/United Technologies Corporation in various roles, retiring in 2015 as the VP of Manufacturing, Continuous Improvement, and Quality. Most recently, he is a co-author of the book Culture, Change, and Continuous Improvement, where he shares his personal experience with meaningful culture change and continuous improvement, from being a weekend away from bankruptcy in 1993, transitioning into being the industry leader in market share, income, and margin over a sustained 25-year period. Martin has been my leader, teacher, and sensei, and I'm proud to now call him my friend. Thank you, Martin, for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Look forward to it.
So how much do you think learning is needed or necessary to successfully facilitate a team going through a lean transformation? Maybe it's a major lean transformation or a small one.
Well, a couple of thoughts on that one. One thing is, I don't think you ever stop learning. So
True.
It's important in, whatever you may be doing that you continue to learn, else you end up just stagnating. Lean is not, I remember our sensei at the time at Goodrich, UTC, if you will, I call it Aerostructures, saying lean will be the simplest thing you ever have to understand, but it'll be the hardest thing you ever do. Yeah. So I think the learning, it relates to a number of different things. One would be just understanding the tools. Another dimension would be how to apply them successfully, which really brings you to maybe the third piece of learning, and that is how to encourage people to themselves understand the tools, warm to the tools, and then get about the business of engaging in change. So all of that is learning. I mean, you got to learn the tools, you got to learn people, you got to learn how to get the tools and the people together, and then learn how to deploy them successfully. So just a lot of learning going off, and it's odd sometimes to find people would say, yeah, we learned that, we've done that. Well, you never do. You never have you've never successfully applied the tools. Up until that point in time, you're applying them all the time. So lots of learning going off, learning about people, learning about tools, learning how to put them together and, make the effort successful.
What do you say is the hardest part of that? Is it learning the tools, or is it learning the people and the culture and how they mesh together?
The hardest part is quite possibly the people. At least that's, I think, has been my experience. Whether that's a definitive answer, I don't know, but that's been my experience. And the hardest part has been almost a converting people from being from rejecting the tools or fighting the tools or fighting the philosophy of their deployment. And those folks can appear in all sorts of different places. They can appear as people in the workplace, if you will, that are actually doing jobs, be they, in say like production control or procurement or finance or anywhere, or out on the shop floor manufacturing stuff. So those folks can be anywhere. I've found them everywhere. One of the tougher groups are those folks in leadership who push back on the tools or fight the tools. almost taking the stance that, hey, I've been in leadership for 5, 10, 15 or 200 years or whatever it may be.
Right.
And there's a reason that I'm a leader. It's because I know stuff. I know how to do stuff. Well, yeah, you do, but we're back to continual learning. So there's that dimension. Having said that, some of the toughest folks to enlist and engage in a lean deployment have turned out to be some of the best. Once they've realized and figured it out, some of the toughest nuts to crack, if you will, have been some of the best folks in the deployment as they've made a personal conversion. So there is that dimension as well.
Yeah, it's very interesting because we've talked in previous Tempest Talks about the journey that the individual goes through. It's not just learning the tools, but they're actually kind of experiencing the 5 stages of grief, if you will. Mm-hmm. I've seen it in facilitating some of the teams that I've facilitated where you've got anger, and then you've got bargaining, and then depression, and then finally acceptance. I know at the beginning of Aerostructures' journey, I talked with Duffy last month about this, but deploying it at Aerostructures, it really started with the culture of the system. So PEP being put in place. Do you think that supported the transition into a lean environment, or was it necessary to happen first, or do you think it could happen at the same time?
Well, specifically at what was at Aerostructures back in the early 90s when we started down this path, the first full 12 months were focused on really overhauling the leadership group in one particular facility, which was the Riverside facility. It was really overhauling that group. And really getting rid is the wrong choice of words. But, other people were offered the opportunity to engage in a direction where we're going to go in leadership. Some chose to take that opportunity as to where we were going to go. Mm-hmm. Some were sort of, well, let me figure out and wait and see. Mm-hmm. But there was undoubtedly some folks that were just absolutely against doing anything different. They were the leaders that were, as I said, I've been a leader for 10, 20 years. And the reason I'm here is because I know stuff and how to do things and lead people, which is actually the absolute last thing they knew how to do, which was lead people. They were maybe reasonable to poor managers and certainly not leaders of people. So the first year was spent in finding other opportunities for these folks, and a lot of them chose to leave. Some of them were helped to leave, and a few did make a transition. There was also the fifth column, the ones that, I'm on board, but really weren't.
Right.
Spend a little bit of time figuring that out. So it sounds quite brutal, but, I guess if you were on one side of the equation, it may have been a little brutal, but we would have gone under without that activity and that changing of mindsets and moving in that, unfortunately, I want to say unfortunately for them, in that direction. So could lean be deployed without a people philosophy? I think well, let me phrase it differently. Could lean be deployed without a change in sort of people philosophy? I guess that all depends on how your people philosophy is at that point in time. If you've got
that makes sense.
If you've got one that is accepting of change and is flexible, but yet is focused on identifying waste, making change, and improving the business, then good to go. But I think quite often some sort of review and overhaul of your people philosophy may be needed.
Yeah, I can totally see that. It's probably the same thing with the type of sensei you have as well. That it would depend on how receptive the industry is, right? Right. For how forceful the sensei is. Did the sensei change through the process? So like at the beginning was the characteristics or the personality of the type of sensei a certain way, then it was different at the towards the end of the implementation, or when it was like fly little bird.
But the sensei that we used, as you know, was with us just short of 10 years. And he was the only sensei we used. And when I say sensei, it was one individual person. It wasn't a company or anything per se. It was one individual person.
Yeah.
And he really did not change in his approach, in my mind, over the years. He was an excellent teacher. He was focused on change. He knew how to do it. He encouraged, cajoled, pushed, and educated us to move on down the path. He was not what's the phrase? I forget what it is, but he did not have a lot of patience for people that were not rowing as fast as he thought they should, that were not engaging in change, particular leadership. He was focused on that were not engaging in change as vigorously as he would have wanted. So there were a few occasions of some a little bit of unrest because of the sensei's application of his skills. But in the book, we said, I think I said that a little bit, but we said we would not have made the progress that we did without the sensei's application of his knowledge, tools, and vigorous, I think I used the word vigorous encouragement. I was trying to be kind with vigorous encouragement, but we would not have made the progress that we did. No doubt in my mind. He was a primary component of that progress and that business, the business that was captured and generated, and the financial rewards that came from all that, which were quite significant.
Substantial. Yes. It was quite a period of concern. I'm trying to remember the phrase you used to say, burning platform.
Yeah.
So it was one of those situations where it was do or die, essentially. Either make a change or no longer be in business kind of situation. And this particular sensei was very forceful with those leaders. Was he a key hand in deciding what leadership stayed and what leadership had the opportunity to go elsewhere?
No, that was the responsibility of Aerostructures leadership.
Oh, good. Okay. That's good to know, because some facilitators get themselves caught between a rock and a hard place by overstepping their bounds, if you will. So that's good to know that the sensei in this sense understood what his boundaries were and what he had authority to do.
Yeah, I mean, he talked to people. He commented on people's input and engagement, but he had no say in leadership. Who was in and who was out, for want of a better phrase.
That's good. That's very good. How quickly did it transition from the manufacturing world into support organizations like engineering, supply chain? Was it further along in the journey, or was it right at the beginning as well?
No, it was further along. In the first 2 or 3 years at least, maybe a little longer, it was solely the lean deployment was solely in manufacturing. Riverside specifically, 93, 94 actually, if my memory serves me right. I think 94 was the first Kaizen event we ever ran. Wow. But it was 94, 95 going into 96. It was I want to say exclusively manufacturing it may have touched upon other things when you get into things like production control that are, and quality that are on the shop floor actively with people. So it probably touched on those sort of departments, if you will, or functions is a better word. But a focused deployment in somewhere, say like engineering, came later, in later years.
Was that a conscious decision by leadership, or did the facilitator kind of guide that path?
Well, there's probably a couple of things that guided it. It was a strain on resources to deploy in manufacturing, because it went from Riverside into Chula Vista and then into the other facilities we had at the time, Foley and wherever. So it was taking a lot of effort from a relatively small group of people that were not doing it on their own, but you do need facilitators, you do need educators, you do need people to organize things. So it was taking a significant amount of effort from those folks. And then in the 90s, if we talk about engineering specifically, there was little engineering going off because the company had not won any business since the early 80s. The V2500 was the last piece of significant business that Aerostructures won, and I think that was about 83-ish that they won that. So here we are, mid 90s, 10 plus years later, with no significant program wins at all.
Wow.
So there was little engineering to re-engineer, if you will, or deploy lean into.
Wow. In the early 90s, were there, key performance metrics or KPIs that the team was concerned about, or was it just kind of like get the job done kind of situation before the lean deployment?
There was no shortage of metrics in the early 90s. There was no shortage of metrics. There was a rather significant shortage of meaningful metrics.
Good.
So lots of things were being measured. An astounding amount of things being measured. And as things got worse, moving into the from the 80s into the 90s, as things got worse, more metrics were generated, but they were just metrics on top of metrics, and it was difficult to determine any meaningful action you should take as a result of looking at those metrics. So in the very early days of lean deployment, one of the metrics that we really, I wouldn't say stumbled across, but that's maybe not a true statement, but to some degree it is. There was one particular department where we, this was in one of the first couple of months, some focus Kaizen events. We determined that the actual days from when an order was released to when an order was closed to manufacture through this particular manufacturing cell was about 36 days.
Holy
and in
cow.
some of the early Kaizen events, it became clear that the actual labor going into that product, if you will, going through that cell, or that component going through that cell, was about 25 minutes.
Oh my gosh.
It was taking 36 days from opening the order to closing the order. Now, to be fair, there was about 25 minutes, I think it was, of it's in the book we wrote, it's actually in there, but I think it's about 25 minutes. There was a 5-hour stabilization. Once you'd been manufacturing this particular part, it went into an oven to be stabilized, otherwise it wanted to spring back to it was like a core type component, and it would spring back. Anyway, there's a 5-hour oven stabilization. So in reality, there was 5 hours, 25 minutes.
Wow.
As compared to 36 days.
Oh my gosh.
And this was quite a revelation to a lot of us, to me at least, and a lot of other people, as to what the hell is going off. That would mean there's a lot of inventory out there. That would mean there's a lot of space being used out there. That would mean people are trying to figure out what the hell do I work first, second, or third. So
Yeah.
if you go back to the metrics, the metric we came up with was days to manufacture. And subsequently, as we started to move into the office type environments, it became days to process. But days to manufacture became a key metric when compared to actual time to fabricate the part, to make the part, to do whatever. So days to manufacture became a key metric that we pushed into every manufacturing cell or every manufacturing area. And that particular metric alone was so revealing. It's incredible. And why a bunch of educated, I'm including myself in that group, why a bunch of educated folks would have not come up with that metric before, it'd beyond me. And maybe we were slow and behind the 8 ball, but such is life. We found it, and it paid dividends big time. And I believe it's still in place to this day, and in Aerostructures. I do hope so, because it's so meaningful.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's literally the point in time from, a order is placed to when you get paid for the order. If you're waiting a month and a week, right, to get this product to you, I mean, Amazon is a great example of making Prime, worth everybody's money, right? So you get it the next day.
Amazon have gone through mine a couple of times with the days to process metric, and they are on the ball. I mean, you can order something today and it's on your, like, you can order something in the afternoon of one day and it's on your doorstep the following day. It's like, holy moly.
It's amazing. Their logistics is pretty incredible.
And that wasn't going down a 100-foot long building. That was traveling several, I don't know how many miles.
Right, exactly. It's incredible. It's one of the places that before I retire, I would love to go see how their logistics works, because seeing something like that would be just life-changing. But what this leads into is, have you ever utilized the lean tools in your personal life, either consciously or subconsciously?
I think the answer to that's yes. I think the answer to that's yes. I've got a little bit of, what is it, OCD or whatever? Yeah, OCD. So I do like to have things in their place. I would hesitate saying they're all set up like point of use and all that good stuff. But I do like things being in their place. And I've thought about this before. That when we started off talking about the lean tools and the philosophy, I think I both consciously and subconsciously use the people philosophy tools a lot, or at least I try to. Thinking of people in a positive light rather than a negative light, and trying to be fair with everybody. So I'd like to think I use more of the people philosophy tools, but I certainly have used the lean tools just because of my OCD thing.
Yeah, I think all of us are, to a certain extent, especially if you've ever facilitated a 5S event. I bring it home. I clean out my closet and it's all organized in a certain way, so I know if I've worn it over the course of the last year. That kind of stuff kind of creeps in a little bit, which is good. It's all goodness.
I do periodically have a 1S rampage through, particularly the garage, and throw stuff out that I've been hoarding for years that I've actually got no use for,
Yeah, I find that with some of my electronics stuff, I end up finding electronics that we haven't used in many years, and end up finding places to recycle them. But I am the same way. I end up using a lot of the people philosophy aspect, a lot, actually. I remember two experiences at Aerostructures, when I was at Aerostructures with yourself and with Greg Peters, where I was like, wow, I'm actually needed in this organization. I talked about it a little bit with Duffy, but there was one particular Kaizen event where yourself and I were co-facilitating it. And And when I came into the room, my first thought was, okay, I'm the co-facilitator for Martin. I am going to make sure that everything is organized the way that it needs to be organized. And then I sat myself in front of the wall and started typing the observations. And I'll never forget it. Yourself and Greg walked up to me and said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm typing the walls." And he said, "No, we need your voice. We brought you into this event because we need outside eyes. We need a different perspective." That spoke like miles to me of how important the one is. And that's all about the people philosophy, and as I call it in my Leanbrella language, culture climate.
Mm-hmm.
That changed me. Aerostructures was the first organization that I worked for where that cultural aspect was really legitimately in our blood. We would listen to each other, we would communicate, we'd actually really communicate quite well. But I'd imagine it took a while to get to that point. It wasn't something that was overnight, that people trusted each other, mutual trust and respect, adult to adult behavior, open two-way communication.
Right.
I'd imagine that would take a long time to achieve. Would you agree with that?
Yes. You don't change a culture by throwing a switch. We're going to take Attila the Hun and his organization and tell them on Monday everything's going to be peachy keen and we're all going to get along with each other, throw the switch and life is good. It's not that easy, is it?
Yeah.
So a people philosophy, I think, is or maybe the major component of a cultural change. How you deal with people, how you relate to people, how you talk to people. All of that. And do you do that in a genuine way, or do you do it in a sort of a clockwork fashion that is obviously, you're acting, you're saying these things, but in reality, your actions say something else as to what's coming out of your mouth. So you do have to be consistent. You do have to believe, in the philosophy that you're trying to deploy to change the culture. And you've got to be consistent throughout, in every day, every time. Even in situations that some people might regard as difficult, you still got to be consistent, both in encouragement to understand and accept and become part of that philosophy. And you got to be consistent with folks that do not do that, that are particularly those in leadership. There has to be consequence. You can't be deploying a philosophy across an organization and allowing some members of leadership to not be deploying. In fact, doing just the opposite. And there's got to be consequences for that as well. And of course, those consequences come in stages. One is we're going to explain to everybody, particularly leadership, what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. Okay, I got it. We've explained it. Now, if you're having trouble, we can help you understand that and bring along. We can give you some training and set expectations. But at some point in time, as my friend Colin would say, if something happens once, it's happenstance. If something happens twice, it's coincidence. And if it happens, this type of bad behavior or not following the philosophy happens 3 times, it's enemy action, and you got to do something.
Yeah. And as a facilitator, because you've been a facilitator for many, many years, and a sensei to me, as I mentioned before, where do you step in as a facilitator and correct that kind of behavior, especially when you don't have hiring and firing responsibility, right? So do you take them aside? How do you handle those kinds of situations with a difficult team that to some extent they need to work through the trouble together, because that's where all the learning comes from, but it doesn't get to the point of like mudslinging? right? How do you control positive, or guide towards positive conflict, if you will? How do you drive that?
I think if you're in well, almost any type of situation, the more people that are in this, they're exposed to this at that point in time, such as, a meeting or a Kaizen event where you get a bunch of people together or something of that nature. Depending what it is, it may be something sort of lean wise that you need to correct immediately. What would be an example? If you if you're putting standard work in place, there's a way to do time observations. There's a way to identify waste and value added, non-value added. And if somebody starts to critique that and change the rules of the game, then no, we need to correct that and bring them back. That this is how you would do time observations. This is how you'd put a % load chart together. This is how you'd put a standard worksheet together, and that has to be done appropriately. So you would need to correct that immediately.
Yeah.
You may then need to pull that person to once. So if you do that with the person there at the time, he's getting corrected, and the people can see, the other people can see he's getting, or she is getting corrected.
Yeah.
You then may need to take him off to one side and say, hey, look, here's how you, in this instance, do time observations, put standard work together, put a % load together and everything. You got it. It's not, you were suggesting doing something different, and that's inappropriate, it's wrong. And then I think you would hope and anticipate that with that guidance, they would follow the appropriate path in the future. If not, you're going to get into the happenstance, coincidence, enemy action type situation.
Yeah. And then do you discuss the behavior with their leadership, and then their leadership handles it, or do you take that on?
Possibly. I think the situation would be a really what's the right word? It would be dependent on the person, the situation, and what was happening. But certainly, after second or third time around, you'd have to be talking to somebody other than the person that is the issue. Yeah. You'd have to be talking to somebody, and that person wouldn't, I think, be their boss at some point.
Yeah, because I've seen, different levels of experience with a facilitator and how they handle some more complex or conflict situations and during a Kaizen event. And some of the more inexperienced ones will make mistakes like calling them out in front of the whole team. Or they themselves will be called out in front of the whole team. Have you seen your leadership style or your facilitation style change as you've learned more about the tools or had more experience facilitating? Have you seen those changes, and what kind of changes in your style, if there is any?
Boy, that's a tough one, Michelle. My immediate reaction is I don't think my approach or style changed. I may not be the best person to answer that, but I don't think it did over the years. I found a people philosophy, warming, right, easy to understand. I didn't think, oh man, I'm going to have to change this particular aspect of the way I approach people or problems. So I'm not suggesting that I knew all about people philosophy as such, but I'm not aware that I had to change anything. I maybe just had to understand and align with, the people philosophy and the words that were there.
Yeah.
You got that, understand it. Oh, okay. So I don't know. As I said, I may not be the best person to answer that.
Did you see a change in your co-facilitators? Because there was a pretty big team in the beginning that was leadership and facilitators combined, trying to make this happen.
Yes. some I'm thinking particularly of leadership at the moment.
Mhm.
And it's back to what we talked about a little earlier on, when Greg Peters came into Riverside, all of leadership was talked to both collectively and as individuals. And the message was, this is where we're going to go. This is the behaviors we're going to use on the way. This is how we're going to get, move forward and improve the business. And then in your role, there are some things that you need to subscribe to and deploy, take to heart, understand, take to heart, deploy. That lean tools, easy to understand, but the people philosophy is a little bit more of a challenge. And certainly some leaders, I'm not going to name any of them,
Yeah,
but some leaders did make a conscious change to the way they approached, various situations. It wasn't a massive group, but certainly some of them that had been brought up in a maybe more, I don't know what the right word is, it theory X, traditional, I'm really not sure, but brought up in a more, I'm going to use theory X, more theory X type environment, did make conscious changes, admirably, some of them.
Yeah, that's great.
And some of the people that were facilitating, I'm thinking about in the resource teams type thing. I think there was, I'm just starting to think of some of the individuals in there now that were there in the continuous improvement resource teams, if you will, at various facilities. And some of them did modify their approach to people, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, it's interesting because Goodrich, or Aerostructures, I should say, Aerostructures was very keen on having a continuous improvement resource team, which was fantastic. So those new hires or new leadership or new to leadership team had a resource group that they could go to while implementing enterprise excellence, for instance. Some organizations don't like having a dedicated continuous improvement team. What are your thoughts around that? Should they have a dedicated team, or does it depend on the type of industry or organization? What are your thoughts around that?
I think it depends on a couple of things. One would be if you're a very small company or a very small business, you just may not have the opportunity to have a dedicated team. You may not even have the opportunity to have a dedicated person if you're a relatively small business. But every business has got opportunity, every business has got waste. So you do need to figure out how do we get rid of the waste, leverage the opportunity, and improve the business. And I'm going to digress a little bit, but even a business that's making a decent margin has still got waste in its business. Its margin could be more. True. Its business share could be greater. So, but if a small business, you just may not be able to put a dedicated person in that role. So that brings another challenge that hopefully I'll look back around to. But in larger businesses, you may need, in the first instance, a dedicated person or team or small team or whatever to give the lean deployment some focus, some structure, some guidance, and some ability to, organize itself. Now, one particular group at Aerostructures started out with a dedicated resource team, and quite frankly, I've forgotten how many were on it, 2, 3, 4, I can't remember. But they became so focused on driving waste out of their responsibility, which was actually a program at the time. There was a program. They became so focused on it. They ran event after event after event. They just pounded away, ripping waste out of that program or that component that was being built. And they got to the point where they had a group of people that did not need guidance and facilitation with events and education. They became a self-sufficient without a at driving continuous improvement, at driving lean, at driving waste out of the business, driving cost out of the business. They didn't have a lean resource team. While some other programs that were structured much like them and needed one. So it was interesting watching that development.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's down to individual personalities too, like who can actually or who actually had an interest in doing that too. But that's really interesting that even under the same roof, you can have such varying needs between programs as well, which kind of
I think you've got to cut your lean deployment cloth to fit the opportunity you've got in front of you. So I don't think it's a one size fits all.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a framework of lean deployment. I think there's a framework of sustaining lean, but that doesn't mean just take the resource team. It doesn't mean you've got to have a resource team dedicated. It's got to be 4 people. Blah 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 blah. Well, wait a minute. What does the situation need?
Yeah.
And how are we going to leverage and improve that situation, and whatever that may be, do that.
Yeah, interesting. Because there's, some smaller teams that may not utilize all of the tools that are in the lean toolbox. And that's okay for those organizations because they're smaller. But a bigger organization may need something like Six Sigma, for instance. They may need Six Sigma because they're more of a large volume type production environment where they could get lots and lots of data out of it. Whereas a mom and pop shop may not need Six Sigma, but may desperately need 5S.
Right. Absolutely.
So have you seen a difference in a team's performance with and without the lean methodology, and what made them perform well and what helped them perform not so well? Help is the wrong word to use there, but.
Well, I mean, we can use Aerostructures as an example. Throughout the 80s and then running into the late 80s and into the 90s, there was, when I hired into Riverside in 86, I think there was about 30 industrial engineers. And
that's a lot.
It was a lot. And given that their charter, if you will, in my mind, is to engineer industry, that's why they call them industrial engineers.
Right.
There was not a lot of industry being engineered.
No.
They were busy, a lot of them, developing these multiple metrics that we talked about, at the beginning. A lot of them were just developing metrics and maintaining metric development, these various measurements that really didn't mean anything. A lot of them were doing that. Wow. So there was not a lot of continuous improvement going off in Aerostructures before 94. After 94, as we began the cultural transformation, the people philosophy deployment leading to the cultural transformation, and the deployment of lean, night and day. And I've worked with, since I left Aerostructures, I decided to leave Aerostructures and retired, if you will. I've worked with a couple of companies, and one I'm thinking of in particular had horrendous delivery and order fulfillment problems. Mm-hmm. And with some basic visuals, basic metrics, mm-hmm. some really rudimentary standard work.
Yeah.
And I hesitate saying the word percent loading, but there was a little bit of percent loading going off. Yeah. They were able to transition with basic metrics, basic visuals, a little linkage and flow. There was some linkage and flow, a little bit of 5S. They changed the delivery metrics night and day. Wow. They changed. They were able to manage without adding any people.
That's awesome.
In fact, they actually stopped working they used to work Saturdays and Sundays, and they dropped back to Saturdays now and again. Wow. and got things back in shape. And that was purely focused in manufacturing with a, let me call it initial deployment of basic lean tools. You know, there was no high junkers involved. There wasn't any, you know, mysterious stuff like that out there. There was no Six Sigma or anything. It was basic stuff.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I notice all the time when I go into different companies. What's what I call wallpaper versus meaningful. There's a lot of wallpaper. And some folks, when they first implement a lean journey, they're implementing a lot of wallpaper. They're not implementing stuff that's actually going to drive change and drive a difference in their business. And so I'm always reminding them when I go into the office, what is this telling me to do? Is life good or bad? Is it okay? Is this driving me to do anything? If not, it's wallpaper.
Well, I think I've used the phrase earlier, at least I think I did, and certainly again in the book, if you will, that I want to say any and every, I think that's probably the case, any and every. I think it may be an example or two, they're not, but 99.9% of metrics need to be meaningful.
Yes.
And actionable.
Yes.
I mean, you just talked that. So when I'm looking at this metric, is it like, oh, that's interesting. Now what do I do?
Yeah.
Or do you look at the metric and go, there's something we need to do there, and that metric is suggesting what that action may be. They have to be meaningful and actionable. If they're not,
yeah, what am I supposed
I'm
to
lost as to why you even generated it.
Yeah, I remember at a previous company that I worked at, we were setting up metrics that was required by a corporate entity, which was a major sub-tier supplier to us, which was interesting that we were changing our aspect for a sub-tier, but whatever. We were putting this big room together full of metrics, and this one weekend that we put this meeting into place, there were 15 people in the room putting all of this stuff on the walls. And I remember looking at one of my teammates, and I was like, do you recognize how many metrics are in here? It was something along the lines of like 1,200 pieces of paper. It's crazy. All across the walls. We were looking at them going, who is going to read this? So that's the other thing that I've been thinking a lot about afterwards. To your point, the metric has to be meaningful, but it also has to be simple enough that your average person can look at it and know whether or not life is good or bad. But they also need to be concise. Because nobody's going to look at 1,200 pieces of paper. Nobody's going to take the time to do that. They want a stoplight chart where it's like, okay, this is good, this is bad. Okay, let's move on. But then I come across engineers, bless us, because I am one, I know you are. We like metrics, we like things that we can see. So a lot of times, some of these engineers and support groups prefer their metrics, right? And so when they have somebody like a facilitator coming in and challenging those metrics, they're kind of married to them. How do you counsel a team in a situation like that, where they're unwilling to change their metric, but you can see, hey, you know what, this is too much. You're overwhelming everybody. How do you fix that?
Well, I've been just sitting here thinking while you were talking, one thing we haven't talked about is policy deployment.
Yes.
And I think that the deployment of policy deployment, if you will, at Aerostructures was a highly significant, highly key thing that was done at Aerostructures, was taking a policy deployment process and deploying it so that it was understandable, meaningful, and actionable.
Yeah.
And you also touched upon something that has got shades of the people philosophy in there. It's tell me what you mean by prefer. You prefer this measurement.
Mm-hmm.
So I need to understand why you prefer it, or we need to understand, is it more meaningful? Is it more actionable? What is the metric doing for you? And if they can explain that and open my eyes, or open, leadership's eyes, holy moly, you're right. Wasn't even thinking about it that way. It's not crystal clear to me, but I understand why you prefer this one. I wonder if we can sort of tweak it a little bit so it becomes intuitively obvious to everybody else. And if so, get on with life. If they've got an absolute inability to explain why they preferred it and is actionable, it's like, you understand now why this one may be better. And if you
Right.
do, we're going to go to this one, right? And if there's an affinity with the preferred one, you're going to end up with a different conversation and say, look, we're just not going to waste any more time on this. But first you've got to understand it, haven't you? As I say, it may be, once it's explained, it's like, holy moly, I wish I was smart enough to figure that one out in the first place.
Right.
So, the whole issue of metrics is a good one.
Yeah, for sure. Which kind of leads me into one of the things that I've been curious as to what you've seen. So last year, of course, was kind of a wash of a year for many people in terms of COVID. And there have been many a podcast and a video blog about COVID and the things that it's changed. How do you think Lean can support an organization through dealing with complex, uncontrollable acts of God kind of things? How do you think Lean supports that? It's kind of along the lines with policy deployment as well, in my mind.
Yeah, I've thought about this one quite a bit. I've probably been rambling all along, but I'm going to ramble a little bit more now, and that would be along the lines of, from a manufacturing point of view. From a manufacturing point of view, I think that in many manufacturing companies, people have still been going to work and manufacturing things. You can't do that remotely, can you? Well, I'll work from home and manufacture the automobile or the refrigerator or the airplane, in my living room. I can't do that. So from a manufacturing point of view, the opportunity has quite probably still been there to be looking for waste, identifying waste and doing something about it. Mm-hmm. But what's been more, I don't know if the word's interesting, what's been puzzling me a little bit more, or I've been thinking about a little bit more, is how COVID has enabled or driven people to be working from home. Mm-hmm. So how do you get your arms around the waste that's in all of those processes that are now being done in geographically, some of them done in different countries? Somebody might have picked up the laptop and gone to the Caribbean and working in the Caribbean on something in Texas or San Diego or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
Now, then I immediately thought, because I've just said you can't see that process. Mm-hmm. Even when all those people are at work at the same place, you often can't see the process either.
Yeah, that's true.
Let's take putting an order in the system, and that order from a customer, that order getting translated into a schedule, and that schedule becoming a document on the shop floor. You can't actually see that happening. You have to do process mapping or something of that nature to see that process.
Right.
So you can still do that. But wait a minute, we can't get them together now.
Right.
There's one step before that I ought to mention. Often opportunities are seen and identified just in the interaction of people on a daily basis. Mm-hmm. That interaction of people on a daily basis is not happening to the same degree or in the same way as it was. Right. So our opportunities are they being identified quickly enough and discussed and put in place where you can go do something about it? Mm-hmm. Or is the working from home, we couldn't see the process before, we certainly can't see it now.
Yeah.
Before we could identify it in various conversations or team meetings or whatever it is, we're not having those so much these days. And then how do we get together and process map it when we're trying to keep 6 foot apart or
Yeah,
whatever?
exactly.
So none of the opportunities have gone away. None of the waste has gone away. In fact, I haven't thought about this angle. One angle is, to what degree has COVID introduced more waste, and where is it?
Yeah,
In processes.
exactly.
And I haven't sort of, that's only just struck me, which shows you how quick I am on this. It's only just struck me as to not only the opportunities that are there in the process, but to what degree has COVID put more waste in, and where is that? So
Yeah,
I
exactly.
haven't thought about that one enough. But it's a challenge. It's changed the dynamics, the environment, the interface in a lot of the non-manufacturing type situations, and I'm sure manufacturing's been affected as well. So
Yeah.
that'd be if it looks as though that the people, the industry and business is starting to reduce a little bit the working from home, which means they're now going into work. So it's going to be interesting to understand, how do we continue with waste identification and elimination, and holy moly, when we do look at this, where the heck did that come from? Oh, well, we put that in because of the working from home situation. Okay, well, let's get it the hell out of it.
Let's remove it now, right?
I wish I was, I wish is maybe the wrong word. It'd be, so having not been in a position to be working from home on a daily basis, I don't have a hands-on experience or observation, if you will, of that issue. But I got to believe it's become a little more challenging, and more waste may have crept in for whatever reason.
Yeah, I would imagine so as well, because some of the clients that I've been talking to, they're concerned about this whole transition from, we've been now at home for so long, now we're transitioning to come back to work, which is like something that most people didn't think would even be an issue. So it wouldn't have shown up on a risk assessment or anything like that. But their biggest concern, at least a couple of them, is getting people to return to work, because they've really enjoyed working from home. And how do you get them to come back to the office, which is an interesting one. I don't know. I haven't wrapped my mind around it either, but it was something that I don't think any of us saw or would have mapped out on a risk analysis. So it's an interesting one.
Yeah, I'm thinking about it initially, and I'm sort of reluctantly, but initially thought about it from a contractual or a legal point of view. What contractual or legal rights have anybody to say, to do your job, you have to do it here?
Right.
But before we got to the contractual or legal, there would be the people philosophy part about it, in as much as are there pros and cons from working from home? Are there advantages? Are there advantages to the individual and advantages to the business, or only to one or the other? And what's the appropriate thing to do?
Yeah.
That's a not a tough question, but it's probably one that's got multiple dimensions that need to be thought through. And I certainly don't have the answer on that one.
I don't either, but it would be an interesting thing to review and maybe write another book on.
Writing a book's a bit of a challenge, let me tell you.
Yeah,
it's not something you throw together one weekend. Well, I guess you could do a really short couple-page book, but it took Colin and I quite a while.
Yeah, I don't imagine that a short story would work for something like that, that.
I think there are some jobs that almost lend themselves to working from home, and you just don't need to be in an office. You probably do need some sort of frequent face-to-face contact with the folks in your business, maybe your customers. I don't know, but I don't for 1 minute think that every job requires every person to go to the same place at the same time every day.
Agreed.
It sounds a little bit too rigid to me.
Yeah. Flex work makes sense. Flex hours, I mean, by that makes sense for a lot of people. What's interesting about it is it brought up systems issues. So one of the folks that I was talking to recently was saying that overnight, they all of a sudden were all online. And the previous decision by their management team was laptops are too expensive, so everybody has a desktop. Well, in a COVID situation, you can't have a desktop, you need a laptop. So overnight, they had to issue laptops to all of their staff, which was an expense that they weren't expecting. And so things like that could have been, analyzed from a risk analysis point of view, but there's big things like that where not everybody had a VPN, that kind of stuff also, which makes a difference too.
Yeah, I've heard, some of the folks that I've talked to over the last year or so have talked about the VPN issue and some folks not having access and not having the right equipment and all that good stuff. So yeah. Even I just want to go back to working from home.
Yeah.
So, and I just said there may be there probably are situations where it's appropriate to be working from home. But I'd look back round to how do you drive lean when you adopt that as a permanent model? Are you back now to you don't have the hallway office interactions, conversations? So you've got waste in your business that you never see or discuss or identify is probably a better word. So that's how's about a business that is appropriately structured where most, if not all, people work from home? How do you drive lean into that? And
that's what I'm most interested in at the moment. If you want to co-author a book for that, let me know.
I know if I was in that type of situation, every time they proposed a Kaizen event, I'd be suggesting we do it in the Caribbean or somewhere like that,
Yes. I'm all for that idea. I'll go to the Caribbean, to Hawaii, whatever. Right. We'll make it work. San Diego, we both live in San Diego. Most people are jealous of that, but well, we'd make it work. Well, Martin, this has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time out to meet with us today. Is there anything that we've missed, or is there any advice that you could give individuals or facilitators, Leanierologists, as I call us, who are embarking on the lean journey and maybe discouraged or frustrated with progress of their teams, or maybe it's slow to implementation? Do you have any advice for those individuals?
If you're the leader of an organization, the ball is yours. You can set the tone, you can set the course, you can clarify the requirements, you can structure your team, make sure you're learning and everybody around you is learning, and move on down the road. And as a leader, you have the ball. You got not only the obligation to be doing this, but you've got the authority, if you will. That authority needs to be used appropriately in the right sort of people philosophy, but it's all yours. Get on with it, and you stand a pretty good chance of being successful if you are leading this thing, and you are deploying the tools appropriately, and you've got the right culture. If you are not the leader and you are, let's say, a middle management, you've got some educating to do of yourself, the folks around you, but you're going to have to try and educate upwards as well to the person that is leading. The leadership is absolutely key to successful deployment. And if you're not getting it, or you're getting something that is in conflict with lean, you got some challenges. If you are a lean zealot, if you will, that's hired into a company because hiring lean zealots is in vogue, I think you can quickly figure out as to Have they hired me to, fill a box that they've got a lean zealot, if you will, and somebody that understands the tools,
Mm-hmm.
and then quickly find out that there ain't anybody around me interested in going where we're going?
Yeah.
Maybe stick around a while, get a bit of experience, and then go find somewhere that has got some leadership that want to go someplace.
Totally.
So leadership's key. If they're in the driving seat, which they are, but if they're in the driving seat to drive lean, life possibility of goodness is higher. Middle management, you've got some educating to do, and it can be done. If we reflect back on Aerostructures, it was not senior leadership that started out with the lean drive at Aerostructures. It was in one location.
Yeah, that's true.
With the general manager.
That's true.
But it can be done. That education did go upwards, and it eventually did become a top down, but it started out at lower levels. The more challenges are for the lean zealots that come in that are not getting the appropriate support, from their leadership. I think another word that springs to mind is persistence. You just got to be persistent in, this is what we're going to do, this is how we're going to, this is where we're going, this is how we're going to get there, these are the behaviors, and so on. So you have to be structured and persistent. If it becomes clear that the company's not headed down that path, then you need to consider a change for yourself.
Yeah, for your own sanity reasons. For
Yeah, I think so.
more.
You can bang your head on a wall for so long, and then it's sort of great when you stop.
Yeah, it is kind of. I've had a couple experiences with that. It's kind of eye-opening. We also learn the resilience of the individual too, in situations like that also.
Right.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy day and meeting with us here in our Tempest Talks. I really appreciate it. Hopefully, you'll be willing to come back and speak with us again sometime in the future. That'd be great.
I never realized how busy I'd be when I had nothing to do.
Right? It's crazy, the stuff that we fill our time with, or that we didn't before because we were at work, right?
Right.
Yeah, well, it's always a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you so much. Thanks for being my sensei. Thank you for being a friend, and for all of your guidance over the years. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Enjoyed it. Take care, Michelle. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.